Good morning, everybody. My name is Alana. I'm one of the educators here at the Duke Lemur Center in Durham, North Carolina, in the United States. I'm handling the technical side of things as we relaunch our Malagasy Scientist Speaker Series. We just ask that everyone might remember to put any questions they have in the chat so we can make sure we get to them. To introduce today's speaker, I am going to turn it over to Madame Beatrice, who is in Madagascar.
Morning, everyone. My name is Beatrice, and I'm with Curza. I make a relation with Curza and this seminar. Okay, we introduce today our speaker, Riavo Voarintsoa. We can let her tell more us about her biography.
Go ahead, Dr. Bore.
Okay. So hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon if you are in Madagascar. My name is Fuari, and today I'm going to talk to you about some of my research that I do for research in Madagascar, and I hope you will enjoy it. So I'm gonna just give a brief outline. I'm gonna provide a little bit of an introduction related to my academic itinerary. And then I will talk about the topic of my talk today, which is about caves and climate and environment over time, and concluding. So about myself, I grew up in Madagascar. I grew up mainly from the capital city of Antananarivo. As you can see in here, Madagascar is an island, the fourth biggest island of the eastern coast of Africa. So I did most of my elementary school, high school, and undergraduate until my master's degree in Madagascar. And one of the opportunity that took me further in my academic when I was invited as a visiting scholar at the Department of Geoscience at Williams College. It was around that time also that I was still working on my DEA or the master's degree in geology. And so I got my master's degree in geology. And while I was working in Massachusetts, I got an opportunity to do my PhD. I applied to the University of Georgia to do my PhD, and I got this PhD in 2017. So most of my PhD research was focused on studying caves, especially formations that we found growing inside caves. So these are some of my pictures, but some of them are very recent because I went to Mauritius, so some of them are taken from Mauritius. But early time when I was doing my PhD, one of the research that I was doing published some papers in Africa. So it was shared in a journal and then highlighted in the research features. So this has inspired me a lot after publishing one of these papers to continue doing research in Madagascar, because this was a work that we did in Africa. And so once I completed my PhD at the University of Georgia, I was offered a postdoc position in Israel. Here was just my first picture, first day being in Israel, in Jerusalem. This is the campus. And during the time I was there, you know, there are some chances to see places, and I was really thankful to see, for example, some of the common landmarks in Israel. But my time in Israel was mainly to do analysis, so doing some experiments, measurements, calibrations, to understand some of the parameters or proxy that we measure in caves. And after my postdoc in Israel, during my postdoc there, I was offered, I got a fellowship, the Mercury Fellowship. So I went to Belgium after that. Belgium is really beautiful. I got the Mercury Fellowship, and I was there for almost 2 years. And my research was mainly focused on reconstructing the past climate and environment in Madagascar. So I combined study of caves. So these are some of the caves, and then there are also some opportunities for me during those times to have some interviews. In addition to caves, I did cross-compare some results using sediments from lakes. So this was one picture that was taken in 2019 during that time. And for most of my project, we always involve local habitants. So this was kind of example of a training for them, collecting some waters and how to treat, how to prepare them, how to store them specifically. So once I finished my postdoc, well, pretty much within the time that I was doing my Marie Curie postdoc, I was offered a faculty position at the University of Houston. So currently I am an assistant professor at the University of Houston. We have the paleogeochemistry group, lab group here. So we mainly focus on still using those geological archives that stores information about past climate and past environment. We use and develop new proxy for now. So my research mainly involves field work, laboratory work, and interpretations for all of those data. So that's a very short itinerary and introduction about myself. Now let's talk mainly about the science and research. So I'm going to mainly focus about one example related to my PhD research about how caves in Madagascar treasure changes of climate and environment through time. So first question is caves. So, you know, there are so many different kinds of caves. There are caves that are formed by lava formation. There are some caves that are formed by glacier carving. There are caves that form by sea caves that people are calling. But the caves that I was mainly interested in working and studying are caves that are formed by dissolution. So these are some examples of those caves, and they are huge. So how does those caves work and how they store environment and climate? So here is a quick and very simplified sketch that show you just how a cave look like as in general, but you have here a thick layer of limestone or calcareous limestone. It's like a effervescent rock. So if you put acid, then it would dissolve, release some CO2. But how does it get dissolved, this rock? So if you have rainfall that is with water and then the atmosphere with CO2, they combine to form carbonic acid, and they might be also added with some CO2 from the soil above the cave. So once they penetrate down to the cave that has an overall chemical formula of CaCO3, they will dissolve that bedrock because it's a little, the water is a little acid. And so it carries some solutions down to the cave. But while that water is penetrating downward, it's super saturated with CO2, but the atmosphere in the cave has a relatively low CO2. So when it reaches the cave, it degasses and also sometimes releases H2O and then precipitate calcium carbonate. So it can either precipitate in the ceiling of the cave that we call stalactites, or it can precipitate at the bottom of the cave that we call stalagmites, right? So this image on the left that you see, that is kind of like the drip of water that get and enter into the cave. It starts to degas, so either it precipitates as stalactites, so the straw like this one, or and then when there is enough water, it reaches the top of a stalagmite, and then they precipitate to form some beautiful crystals, as you see growing in the cave. So these guys that we call stalagmites, so because you see they are fed by drip water. So every time each of those drops kind of form a very thin layer, they record the environmental changes through time. And so how cave treasures those changes of climates. These are some ways on how caves store some of those changes of climate and environment. But I'm gonna still ask some of those questions, like why do we care? Why do we study climates in the past? Why do we want to know about changes in the past? So our principle is that the past is a key to understand the future. So we use many of those information that we get from the past information to improve climate models. And so how does this apply, for example, in Madagascar? As you know, just very recently in 2022 of this year, has experienced some severe damaging cyclones. And some of those cyclones may get intensified on land, depending on how climate has changed in the past. And that has happened very recently, and this was an archive of a journal saved in the Madagascar Library. It was published in 1992, and highlighting the drought and famine in the southern part of Madagascar. So the way we need to understand climate is to better improve climate models to predict some of those unpredictable climate, some changes, so that there are some improvement and some preparation. And this is some example in Madagascar, but not Madagascar is the only place that is affected by some of those changes, but there is also other places. If I am talking about Houston, where I am currently working, in 2017, Houston also has been hit by a severe hurricane, Harvey, that is called, and has flooded so many places and caused a huge infrastructure damage. And there was also the winter storm that was just last year. It was during the time that I moved here in Houston, and Houston has never experienced snow for several decades. So this was very unexpected and has had a large impact in many populations. So many pipes broke, and so many people have been affected by those natural catastrophes. So why do we care? So these are, of course, these are happening once in so many hundreds of years, but the climate applies. It's not like the weather, but it's the average statistical changes that's average approximately 30 years. So we look at that, and if there is some anomalies in the records. So here is just looking at a very, very, very long time scale, 60 million years up to the present. So the time where we are living right now is around this time. This is the pre-industrial, and these are some of the prediction by those climate models saying if there is no change in the atmospheric CO2, then we should be behaving around the same temperature as before that. But if there is a lot of emission, for example, of CO2, there is more of a tendency to increase temperature. But I'm not going to talk too much about that, but the idea how to improve this projection, because still right now in so many places there are some data that is not yet available. So to improve those and to have this better picture about how the Earth's climate has changed, how it has fluctuated, we are focusing on using, for example, cave sediments. So cave sediments, as you see, how the question is, for example, how can they store information about climate, information about past changes? And so if I go back into this, one of the important natural elements that we look in caves are stalagmites, as I said, but we look at stable isotopes. So if we saw earlier how these equations goes, how the precipitation, the solutions, and then precipitation back into the cave. So we use stable isotope. Calcium carbonate is the chemical formula for limestones that is composed of calcite or aragonite. And we can either look at the changes in oxygen isotopes, or we can look also at the change of carbon isotopes. So this is one of the most commonly used, but I think I'm not going to go into much detail because it's maybe very complicated to the audience who are not yet very familiar with it. But the idea is oxygen exists in water. If I take just that simple example, and this water in here can reflect the water that drips and feed the stalagmites, but at the same time, it can reflect the water that is in the epicars, which most of the time is fed by rainfall. So any changes in rainfall can be transferred and carried and preserved in the cave at each time it is deposited. And we measure it using several of those equipment. I'm just showing you this. These are some of the tools that we use in the lab, the equipment. This is a mass spectrometer that separates the mass. So we put the sample inside these little tubes, and then we put acid, release the acid, and then measure the isotopes when they go through some of those magnets here. The other proxy that we use is petrography. So this is petro is rock, graph is kind of like the figure or the image of the rock. So we mainly look at the layer bounding surfaces, which is the boundary between one layer above and one layer below. So there are mainly two common types that we call type E surfaces and type L surfaces. So type E surfaces, as its name, erosional surface. So these are some guys that shows some evidence of erosion. So the early deposited layer of stalagmite has been eroded. And the type L surface on the opposite side shows these layers that are thinning upwards. So you can clearly see that here the width, how wide the sample looks like, it becomes narrower and then smaller and thinner when it goes upward. So how does this translate into climate? So if we take, for example, the type E surface, which you can see clearly if we look at a sample like this. So these are clearly some of the erosion pattern that you identify, and some negative detritus, dust, the dusty material, clayey material. And so if here's one of that layer that we see earlier, this is one part that has been removed from that. So we interpret this as like an interval with maybe very wet, humid conditions where you may have more vegetation cover, for example, and then you may have water that is more acidic and less supersaturated, and then they enter the cave. So instead of depositing a layer of stalagmites in here, you will deposit some, you will remove the layer that has been already deposited in here. On the other side, if we look at the type L surface, which is less deposition, if you experience a dry conditions, very dry conditions, then you would not have too many drip water and even no drips at all to reach the cave. So sometimes your sample stops growing. So this is why you start to have less and less depositions. And this is how you actually see in some of the sample how this looks like from those less deposition. So there is clear visual evidence for less deposition and versus erosion pattern. And how do we study this sample? So we slab them, we prepare some thin sections. These are other thin sections that I use from my sample from Namibia, and then we use a microscope. So the microscope that we use is slightly different from the biological microscope. We call this a Petrographic microscope. We have this platform rotating, and we have also crossed polar. So there's plane polars, and then there's another polarizing to identify the mineral birefringence and changes. So we use this to look very carefully into the sample. It's a very, very thin section, approximately 30 microns. So we use those as an important tool to identify the changes between a boundary between two layers. And how does this apply now? Like using some of those stalagmites in terms of reconstructing climate and how there is a change. So if we take this case of Madagascar, Madagascar is located at kind of the southern boundary of the intertropical convergence zone. So the intertropical convergence zone is one zone that we call also ITCZ. People also call it a narrow rain belt near the equator. So it's a narrow latitudinal zone of wind convergence and precipitation in the tropics. So there is a place here in northwestern part of Madagascar that is only visited, like mainly the rainfall of it is related to the latitudinal, like how north and south the ITCZ is moving. And there are some hypotheses that has been tested by other climate modelers that says that the ITCZ, even though it moves seasonally north-south, there was a time in the past that it has maybe remains the mean position of it relatively north or relatively south. And that is mainly driven by a difference in temperature between the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. There is also other factors that drive it, but I'm not going to talk into that. And so one model says if there is overall a cooler temperature, cooler conditions in the northern hemisphere, then the southern hemisphere is warmer, then the ITCZ is, the position of that ITCZ is pushed relatively south. And the other model says on the opposite side, if the southern hemisphere is relatively cooler versus the northern hemisphere, then the ITCZ is pushed further north. So there is those kind of general patterns that has been used to interpret the cause of rainfall, especially the tropical rain belt behavior in the tropics, and to interpret how does that transfer to the local climate. So for taking to Madagascar, I'm going to talk to you about those two samples that are collected from two different caves in northwestern part of Madagascar. So these two are really this is from a smaller cave, this is from a larger cave. And what you notice here, when I first saw this and when I first divided the sample into two, first thing I saw with this was maybe the area has experienced some earthquakes. And so the earthquake has shifted some of the, position of the water that feeds the sample. But later, what I realized that those trenches that you see actually in here are some age. So these are when we collect some powder to get some age of the sample. And so what we see is that this part before here has approximately this age. And then this right here, there is a very gap in deposition around that time. So it's almost 7 or 6, more than 6,000 years of non-deposition. And then after that, there is a return in the deposition of the stalagmites. And then if we look at this other one as well, we get some age at different layers. And what we see as well is that around earlier this time, we have deposition. And then these intervals right here is represented by a big gap in deposition. And then it returns back to some new deposition of stalagmite layers. And we still combine that with some of the information that I talked to you earlier. We measured the width of the stalagmites, like how wide these are, how narrow these are. So we really measured these. So as you can see in here, around this time interval with the highlighted in red, all of the shape is narrowed, and the same for this one. At this interval, it is narrowed. But more importantly, if we apply the petrography that I mentioned earlier, this interval with non-deposition correlates very nicely with this type L surface. That means less in deposition. So this is what we identify in these two samples that were from two different places are that the early time in here, which is early Holocene, that I was calling it because that's a specific time frame in the geologic time. So the early Holocene, there was a time for deposition for the stalagmites. And then the mid Holocene, there is a big gap in deposition, and that is recorded in the two samples. And then returning back to the late Holocene, what we see is that the stalagmites returns back to deposition. So this is like a reference from an international distinction between the early, middle, and the late Holocene, and this actually more or less correlates with the interval that we see in Madagascar. But how does this actually translate into the climate? How does the climate is getting preserved in Madagascar? If we talked about this rain belt that is moving north and south in Madagascar, these are can be linked to what I said. There was a long-term, maybe northward movement or southward shift of the ITCZ. So this is captured in these three graphs right here. I'm not going to talk maybe too much about this figure, but these are just temporarily reported between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. But I think I'm just gonna focus on this interpretation for this figure. So the early time there was deposition, so you can see that the rain belts mainly have maybe moved relatively south relative to that. And then during the time when there is no deposition because there is no water that feeds the cave and then precipitate the stalagmites, maybe this ITCZ has remained farther north. And then coming back to the late Holocene, when the stalagmites started to grow again, is when maybe this ITCZ has shifted a little farther south. And so if you look at stable isotope is more complicated because there are a lot of information that that can be related to that. I'm happy if anyone is interested in talking into more details about it, but I'm just going to provide some summaries. But when we look at the carbon isotopes and the oxygen isotopes, for the early Holocene, this is carbon isotopes and oxygen isotopes, and that is presented in these figures, and here they are more or less nicely correlated. But the value for the carbon isotopes is the sample is poor in carbon, in heavy carbon. And so this is kind of the interpretation is maybe some changes if we assume that carbon isotope composition reflects some changes in vegetation or the landscape bioactivity above the cave, then these may reflect kind of like the vegetation can respond very nicely into changes in the climate. But then if we look, and of course there is no deposition in here, so I'm not going to interpret much. So then maybe there is another paper that talks about some of the periodic droughts around this time interval. And if anyone is interested in that, I'm happy to share that paper. But the late Holocene, what has changed, the oxygen isotope has relatively remained within the same range. And maybe this would reflect those latitudinal migration, the latitudinal shift of the rain belt as well. When we look at the carbon isotopic composition, there was some shift, or there is some big shift. There are several debates, there are several arguments that interpret the shifts and the changes into the carbon isotopic values. Maybe human impact, because around this time, people started to settle in the island. There may be also some changes increasing temperature and causing, leading to some dry and then altering some of the isotopic composition in the carbon isotopic composition. But I'm going to conclude and just saying that caves, regardless of where it is, but the one that I showed today is just an example in Madagascar because it may be relevant to people who are attending it. So caves can be studied very carefully to understand how our climate and environment has changed in the past. And the example that I showed you in here was just a 1% of example, and also very little example of the proxy or the tools that we use to understand it. But there are so many, and it is quite complicated. And I'm just summarize my talk just by saying doing science is very important to advance knowledge and also to find solution for sustainable Earth. So this is true for so many things, and doing science can start with us, and we will educate ourselves what is important, what should we care, should we be mindful about our environment, and how should we take care of our environment. And as I said, science is important, but the thing is, the work of a scientist is not always seen by many. And I compare it as this clock. This was a clock that my cousin gave me on my birthday, but how I can compare science doing it. So how the society is seeing us is then what they see the clock right in front of us. It tells us the time. It tells us everything about how things are changing, how weathers and meteorology. So those are kind of the current information that we have. But there are also a lot of scientific study that we cannot see, we cannot touch directly, but these actually make function the system that makes the clock working. So my job is mainly that person behind and inside that clock that makes it work, because some of the information that I provide to climate modelers, to the other scientific community, will be useful to improve how we make climate model more reliable and produce reliable information. And last thing is, I would say, this is my motto, saying be better every day. I think we do things yesterday and we don't compare to others, but we know what is important, and we always try to do our best whenever we can and as long as we can do it. So with that, I want to thank you everyone for attending the talk today, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Dr. Roy. Thank you so much. Just a reminder, if anyone who's watching has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to those. Madame Beatrice, does anyone there have any questions we want to start off with?
Thank you for your presentation. And I can ask the assistant if we have any question. For me, I have one question. I see the stalagmite and the stalactite form. So how many times we need maybe to have, for example, 1 centimeter of stalagmite? We have, I think it needs many time to have the forms. So if we can have, we can estimate maybe, for example, for stalagmite, how many times we can have it.
You mean how long, how old is the sample? So most of the time it varies, but that's a very good question. So if I go back to this slide just quickly into here, you can see that this sample is approximately 33 centimeter, right? So, and then this one is approximately 90 centimeters. So, sorry, 9 centimeters. So it's not very long, and it really depends. Sometimes if all of the conditions are met, you might have a stalagmite that is like several meters tall. And so depending if they are growing very fast, it does not appear outside that if the sample is so long, then it's going to be so old. But maybe if it's growing so fast, then it might be just like covering the past 10,000 years. So like in this sample, as you see, it grows relatively fast after this time. So approximately 1,000, this is 1,000 years. Like this is kind of approximately 1,000 years of deposition. But then there was a time that there is no deposition at all, right? So those really depends on if you have water that feeds the cave and then precipitates to form the stalagmites. But that's an excellent question.
Okay, thank you. And another question for me, with this precipitation dissolution, and it is, we can have a different form if we have a different climate and the different environments, or we can see a same form in the caves if we have a different climate and the different environments?
And that's a very good question as well. Well, I'm going to answer it in two ways. So those formations inside the caves, they have different forms. You know, there are the ones that are forming from the ceiling of the cave that we call stalactite. There are some that is forming from the ground, and that is stalagmites. There are some that looks like draperies. There are the flow stones. There are the columns, right, when they're connected. But the one that we are mainly interested are the stalagmites, such as the one that I show you in that picture, because when they are fed by just drops of water. So any tiny bits of drops of water that falls into the top of those stalagmites, and they form a very thin film of water, and then they precipitate. So in terms, to answer your question, after comparing with some of the morphology, so now the shape of the stalagmites by itself, sometimes when it is too dry, so the climate is too dry, then there is less deposition. So as you can see here, the sample becomes very, very narrow. So if you select a very good sample that shows some of those layerings, then it becomes very, very narrow. But if you are have, let's say, wetter climates, and it's favoring the formation of those stalagmites, you have deposit them, but then they might just have like a more sample precipitated at the side of the stalagmites. But I think the difference is not very much, it's not really big, because you can see we measured it in millimeter right here, right? And so approximately it's a variation of 2-3 centimeters and so forth. So how narrow and how wide they are, it can be used as a tool to interpret that. Maybe when it becomes narrow, there might be a drying trend. But of course, this was simplified, but if you combine it with stable isotopes, you know, other elements, other compositions, looking at the mineralogy, then what is the mineralogy of the sample, that you can add different information to make a concrete and complete interpretation. Very good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat. Who guest wants to know what your favorite thing about working in caves is?
Well, first I was scared going into the dark at the beginning, but what I really like working in caves, I think the temperature, the climate inside the cave is kind of cool, and the breeze inside. Much of the caves that I have been is kind of like it gives you that environment that is kind of stable and have perfect humidity for myself, like doing the work. And I have not, there were times that I saw some fossils that were, you know, preserved in there, some bats colonies and some little animals. So far, I have not seen the scary animals because I've heard that there may be some crocodiles in those. So I have not been in some of those caves, but one of the things that I really enjoy seeing is the beautiful decorations by those natural rocks and how they form, and they can preserve such of information. I think those are one of the things that really interested me into studying those features later on.
Awesome, thank you so much. Do you have any advice for any of the students joining us today about getting involved in science at all? It
So as I said, everybody, science is highly needed. It brings knowledge, and knowing about why things exist, why things has changed. If you have those knowledge, you can provide a solution to the society. And even though it's not for the current time, it may benefit a future generation. So always think about the future, because future is how the generations in the future would benefit from some of the work that we are doing. And I'm giving also another example. I know when you're doing science, I mean, it's kind of like the evolution of cell phones. In the old times, our cell phones was just like, you know, it's so hard, or maybe mail even. So we cannot connect with our family in the past because we just like do it by mailing and one person taking it to another. But because of science, technology has highly advanced, right? And so this has helped. Now we can Zoom and we can live stream. Those in 50 years past, this was not possible. And if I take that as an example now, if you guys are working, the case is the climate, there are people also who are working just about climate, modeling how climate works, because the Earth is a system that is very unique, has a different system, biosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and all of them works all together. Every single person is needed to understand how they work, how they perform, and the connection, because science is trying to connect all of the disciplines to, you know, improve and make the world a better place. And we need people to do that. Of course, it requires time, it requires a lot of patience, but I think seeing the future as a place for a better future for our future generation is also as important as doing the science.
That's great. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions over in Madagascar?
No, I think it's okay for us.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Vore, for sharing your time and your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. It was fascinating being able to hear you speak and learn so much about caves. I had no idea. And I would love it if you were able to share your research papers with us or with James so he could forward them along, because I personally would love to read them. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and end the live stream. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to you, especially the Riavo. And I say thank you. Thanks for the donor for their contribution, and also DLC for promoting the accomplishment of its series of presentation. And I thanks also the assistant, Curza assistant, to attend this presentation. Okay.